bring into the conversation Tom Malinowski. He's the Democratic nominee for Congress in New Jersey's 7th District and the former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor under President Obama. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Let's talk about what's playing in the 7th District of New Jersey. We were just talking, it's sort of suburbs of New York, Summit, that area, sort of western suburbs. What are people talking about when you knock on doors and you go to events? What's top of mind?
So the election in districts like mine is still going to be about health care. It's still going to be about transportation, a huge issue for New Jersey. It's going to be about taxes and the impact of the tax bill on middle-class homeowners in districts like mine. But I got to say, with this week's news, there's an opportunity for Democrats like me, especially those of us who have a background in national security, to say that the Democratic Party is now the party of patriotism in this country, the party that is willing to defend our country against our true foreign adversaries, the party of law enforcement in this country that is willing to trust the FBI over Fox News, that will believe our intelligence community when they say our country's under attack. And people I talk to increasingly, whether they voted for Trump or not, want somebody who will at least provide checks and balances in the Congress and do something to stand up for our country in an unsettled time.
Tom, you were there in the closing days of the Obama presidency when you say you were racing against time to try and get information out on Russia. Many Democrats say that the reason why that information did not get out was because Mitch McConnell would not agree to sign on to a bipartisan statement, and that if they did it by themselves, it would be viewed as wholly political. But at the same time, Democrats say, well, if we would have known more, we would have done more. Who's right? Why didn't that information get out? Is it fair to blame McConnell?
I think it's fair to blame McConnell because I think we need this to be bipartisan in the United States of America. We need to stand together when our country is under attack. And you know, let's talk about what's happening right now.
But is that really what happened? Did Mitch McConnell put the brakes on that?
He put the brakes on the bipartisan statement.
People?
Yes, that's right. Now, we did inform the American people. I mean, we did say the intelligence community came together unanimously to tell the American people what was likely to happen in the election, and, well, the rest is history.
Isn't, Tom, though, the president right in part when he says these violations happened under President Obama and that you all should have done more? Do you all regret not doing more?
I believe we should have done more, actually. Yes.
Why didn't we?
I think it was very, very difficult to act on an issue like this when there wasn't complete bipartisan support. But let's talk about what's happening now, because this is a little bit like, you know, Harry Truman saying, you know, Pearl Harbor happened on my predecessor's watch, so I wash my hands of it. We need to defend our country right now. And the House Republican leadership in particular, let's not forget, has been 100% complicit in President Trump's attacks on the FBI, on our intelligence community from day one. So all of this criticism, this shock over what he said in Helsinki, which he has said 100 times before, it means nothing to me unless the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate brings up legislation to protect Mueller, brings up legislation on sanctions, brings up legislation on dark money and foreign money in our politics, brings up legislation on the president's tax returns, brings up legislation to stop this trade war, which they can do. Enough of the tweets, enough of the complaints. Do something. That's what people in my district are demanding.
So I'm a Jersey boy from Mississippi. So I want to pivot back to state politics. You talked about the Democrats are the new patriots. Now, how would you describe your political agenda? Where do you see yourself in this current, what we might describe as a civil war within the Democratic Party? You have folks like Ocasio-Cortez, who represents a particular kind of progressive thrust, right? And then you have traditional Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and others who are saying that we need to stay in the center. How do you see yourself fitting in that debate? And kind of detail some policies to kind of address what everyday ordinary workers are experiencing, right? Flatlining wages, declining wages, uptick in inflation, where people on Main Street feel like they're not really feeling this recovery.
Well, so I'm going to question the premise. I think, of course, there are differences of opinion in the Democratic Party. But if you look at Democrats in the U.S. Congress in what I think is a time of national emergency, they have hung together in an extraordinary way on virtually every single important vote. Look, there are a lot of ways in which I want to change this country. But I don't think 2018, the midterms, are fundamentally about changing this country. They are about saving this country. They are about coming together, finding a bipartisan consensus on protecting America from our foreign adversaries, and holding together as one America at home. If we can't do those things, then the minor debates within the Democratic Party on economic policy will seem very trivial to historians 20, 30, 40 years from now.
All right, Tom Malinowski, we'll be talking much more, I'm sure, over the course of this campaign. The Democratic nominee for the 7th District in New Jersey. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Still ahead this morning, President Trump once again weighs in on whether he'll get involved in Justice Department investigations. That's still to come on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.